Welcome to CAD Resource. Let's talk about the Spline tool. Let me show you how they work. Right up here under the Spline tool, I can actually click in the drop-down. I can see there's multiple ways we can create splines. So we have the spline here. We have a style spline. We can also create a spline on a surface. Or an equation-driven curve, but right now let's just focus on regular splines as well as style splines. So I'm going to choose a regular spline here. I'll go ahead and choose the front plane. And I can click where I want to start. And then again, I can click where I want to end, and notice that tool stays active. Now, if you actually hit escape, at any point in time, that will turn that off. And this turns into what would look like a regular line. However, it's not. This is actually a spline. So you can grab these little controls here. And you can move those to create pretty cool shapes. All from one straight line. We also have a direction vector. I can grab that, and I can add more power. Or less power on how much control this direction vector has over that spline. I can do the same thing over here. I can change the angle. And I can control how much it influences that spline. Now, we don't have to have just 2 points. We can have multiple points. So if we come up here to spline again, click here, click here, click here and click here. You get pretty much exactly the same thing. Now you can grab those points. You can move them around. And notice each one of those points has those same little controls. I can control how much effect that end point does have. And I can also change that angle very easily. Same thing with these other points over here. I can start moving and twisting. And doing all kinds of very interesting things with splines. In fact, if you click on the spline itself, you can right-click on it. And you can see we have all these other things we can add. So we can add tangency control. We can add curvature control and all these other things. So definitely take a look through all these different controls you can add and use with your spline. In fact, you can add additional points. You can remove them and so on. So there's a lot you can do with a spline. Now, I also want to cover the secondary type of spline. So let's go ahead and create a spline, which is what's called a style spline. So a style spline, click again, click over here and click over here, and go ahead and hit escape. Now the style spline is very similar to a regular spline, but we have these kind of control construction geometry lines that are surrounding the spline. So I can grab the points themselves. And I can drag those points. Or I can grab the lines and move those around. So it makes it really easy to control the spline. And get a nice, free-flowing shape. That's a little bit easier to work with than a regular spline. Because you have this control of being able to pull and stuff like that. You can also get weird shapes. Like this little shape over here. It doesn't flow very nice. So the style spline is really good for, product design. When you want a nice flowing curve from one thing into the next, and by using these kind of bigger controls that are attached to these lines, we can define that a little bit better. So those are the two different types of splines. Now, I do want to caution you though. When you're working with splines, there's no really good way to define the spline itself. When you go to a drawing or going into manufacturing, I can't call out a radius or a length, right? Because it is a free-flowing curve, it makes it really hard to deal with in the real world. But if you're working with consumer products and you want something smooth and flowing that looks really nice, definitely use the splines cause they are very powerful. But just keep in mind that limitation. That it's going to be hard to define that in a drawing format, or if you want to create some type of a CAD file. That's defining exactly the size, location, rotation and so on. It's very hard to do that with splines. So just keep that in mind. And in fact, another recommendation that you might want to consider is actually clicking on a spline itself and switching it over to construction geometry and then doing what's called a best fit. So you can choose like a 3-point curve and come out here and like snap to that spline and get really close to that spline or that shape. And then maybe use a tangency arc. And so you can kind of like follow that spline around and see if you can get a very similar shape to what it is. Notice what I did right there. So I've created a bunch of regular arcs that are using the spline as a reference. And now, each one of those can actually have a definitive dimension. So I can say, hey, this dimension here, and there it is. I can save this dimension over here. Same thing. Each one of these I can define a value for them as I go through this. And that's going to make it a little easier to define this kind of information actually on a drawing.